Most of us think we know what a traffic ticket is. It's a penalty, right? A fine you've got to pay. It's just a bad end to an already long day. But what if we looked at it from a completely different angle? From a legal and forensic accounting perspective, that little piece of paper might just be a complex financial instrument. Today, we're going to break down a fascinating strategy that treats it exactly like that, as a commercial transaction, not a criminal one. Okay, let's get into it. So here's the fundamental question we're exploring. Is a traffic ticket really governed by criminal law, or could it fall under something like the Uniform Commercial Code? The whole strategy we're looking at today argues that when an officer hands you that citation, they're actually kicking off a commercial contract. Now, I know that sounds out there, but this interpretation is built on a really interesting and, pretty controversial path through state statutes, federal codes, and the very definition of what the state even is. So it all starts with the Uniform Traffic Citation, the UTC. To you and me, it's a summons to show up in court. But through the lens of this legal strategy, it's seen as a presentment. Think of it like an offer to contract or even a negotiable instrument. So let's start peeling back the legal layers that actually support this pretty unconventional point of view. To even begin to understand this commercial argument, we have to lay the groundwork. First, we need to establish the legal basis for the idea that the state can, and does, act like a corporate entity. And this whole concept, believe it or not, is rooted directly in Georgia's own laws, and it provides the foundation for everything else that follows. Now get this. This right here is the statutory anchor for the entire argument, and it's pulled directly from the official code of Georgia. It says, plain as day, that the State Properties Commission is a body corporate. This isn't someone's interpretation, it's the black letter law, and that language is what legally empowers a part of the state to act just like a business. So what exactly is a body corporate? Well, think of it as a legal fiction. It lets a group or an entity act like a single person when it comes to business. It can own property, it can sign contracts, and it can sue or be sued. This is the crucial link, right? Because if the state can act as a corporation, then maybe its interactions with us, the citizens, can be looked at through a commercial lens instead of a purely criminal one. And it turns out this corporate status isn't just a quirky thing in Georgia property law. If you look at the federal level, under 28 U.S.C. Section 3002, the United States itself is explicitly defined as a federal corporation, specifically for the purpose of collecting debts. So the argument here is that Georgia's 1981 Adoption Act basically took that same corporate debt collection framework and plugged it right into its state court system. And that really starts to blur the line between public law and private business. Okay, so if we're working with the premise that the state is acting like a corporation, then the next question is pretty obvious. What does that make the traffic ticket in this whole scenario? Let's move to our next layer and see how this argument builds, because this is where the citation gets reframed as a commercial contract that actually creates a debt. So here's how the transaction is built, step by step. The officer issues the citation. Then they often take your license, which, in this view, acts as collateral to make sure you show up. It's securing the deal. Your signature isn't an admission of guilt. No. From this commercial viewpoint, it perfects their claim. It's your agreement to play by their rules. And at that exact moment, the state, acting as a corporation, allegedly opens an accounts receivable on its books. Just like that, you owe them. And that brings us to a huge legal question. I mean, if letting you drive away with that ticket is basically an extension of credit, then where are the disclosures required by the Federal Truth in Lending Act, or TILA? Regulation Z of that act is super clear. It requires detailed information about interest rates, finance charges, all of it. The fact that there's no TILA disclosure form is a massive pillar of this entire defense strategy. So if the problem is commercial, the proposed solution is also commercial. Instead of pleading guilty or not guilty, this strategy uses a specific provision from the Uniform Commercial Code called acceptance for honor. The theory is, by accepting the ticket for value, you're acknowledging their presentment of a debt, but you're also claiming to settle that account right then and there through a private administrative process. You're trying to extinguish the claim before it even gets into the criminal system. Okay, so let's talk about the judge's role in all of this. Because the next layer of this argument suggests that the person sitting on the bench might not be acting in the way you think. They may not be a constitutional officer, but an administrative one. We're calling this the two hats theory. And this chart lays out the difference perfectly. A constitutional judge, that's what we all picture, is usually elected, presides over a court of record, and their focus is on justice under common law. But an administrative officer, Well, they're often appointed, and they operate in a statutory forum created by the legislature, kind of like the one arguably set up by that 1981 act. Their job isn't about justice, it's about enforcing compliance with the corporate code. They're there to manage the contract. So why does it matter which hat the judge is wearing? Because everything changes. Administrative hearings can have far fewer constitutional protections. And even more importantly, it brings up a huge question of judicial conflict of interest. I mean, if a judge is basically acting as an administrator for the state corporation, collecting money for them, how can they possibly be impartial? This could be a violation of federal law, specifically 28 U.S.C. Section 455, which says a judge has to recuse themselves if their neutrality could even be questioned. And that brings us to the final, and maybe the most powerful layer of this whole strategy, challenging the financial bedrock of the transaction itself by demanding a formal accounting. This is the absolute core of the audit. If the state corporation put your ticket on its books as an asset and accounts receivable, then fundamental accounting principles demand that there be a matching entry somewhere to balance the ledger. The question is dead simple. What was that entry and where is it? You see, this is all based on a practice that's been around for centuries, called double entry bookkeeping. It's the law of accounting. You cannot just create value out of thin air. For every debit, there has to be a credit. For every asset you create, you have to record a matching liability or equity somewhere else. It's non-negotiable. This table just shows the mystery in plain sight. On one side of the ledger, you've got the state's shiny new asset, the money they expect from your ticket. But what's on the other side? What's the entry that balances this transaction? The whole strategy argues that without proof of this counter-entry, the debt itself isn't financially valid. It's a ghost. And so the final move is to put the court on the spot and demand a full audit of the transaction, one that's compliant with generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP. It's a direct challenge. It's saying, show me your books. Prove to me this is a valid debt according to the rules of accounting. And the implication is pretty clear. If they can't, then the debt is fraudulent and has to be wiped clean. So when you stack up all these layers, the state acting as a corporation, the ticket being a contract, the judge wearing two hats, and the very questionable accounting, what you get is an attempt to completely reframe the encounter, to move it out of the world of criminal law and into the world of a commercial dispute. And if you just follow the money, the commercial argument gets even stronger. All the fines and fees from supposedly separate agencies like the Department of Driver Services and the Department of Revenue, they all flow right back to the state treasury, funding the corporate body. This structure, plus Georgia law under OCGA 45-3-5, which requires oaths for officers handling the state's accounts, makes them look less like public servants and a lot more like bonded financial agents protecting corporate assets. At the end of the day, this whole thing is a really sophisticated challenge to the court's jurisdiction. It's not about arguing whether you were speeding. It's an attempt to say, look, you're treating this as a criminal case, but your own structure, your own laws, your own actions, they all show this is a commercial dispute. And if that's what this is, then you're in the wrong courtroom, and you're not using the right rule book. Which leaves us with one final, really provocative thought. The next time you see a traffic ticket, ask yourself, is this an accusation that I need to defend myself against? Or is it an invoice that needs to be audited? Are you walking into that courtroom as a defendant, or are you walking in as a debtor in a commercial dispute? It's a question that completely changes the entire game.